Hey, Cypher here. We've all heard about violence in the United States. In the news, it's fairly easy to focus on. But I've got a historical question. Is violence in America worse? The easy answer to whether or not violence has gotten worse in America is a clear and indefatigable no. Violence in America, by most conventional measures, has sharply decreased in recent years. That begs the question, though, how do we make such measurements, and when was it the worst? Mostly we measure violence in America by murder rate. The rate has clearly been decreasing since the 1990s. Our country has more people living in it currently than the number of Americans who have died throughout our entire 2.5-century lifespan, of natural causes or otherwise. Yet our total number of murders for the last couple of years is that of the late 1960s. Per capita, we are definitely less likely to see murder. Murder rate is problematic though, since violence does not only mean murder. There's other violent crimes like physical assault, armed theft, and rape. Interestingly enough, these numbers are also lower than in the 1990s. There is a very clear turn in the early 90s that shows decreasing crime rates across the board. Of course, we don't really have numbers for this prior to World War II, but one can be certain that the amazing decline in crime now is unparalleled in American history. Pre-World War II, every state in the Union has its own version of a famous early killer. From California's Joaquin Murrieta, my favorite is Nevada's Kehoe, all the way to the worst serial killer in our history, H.H. Holmes in Chicago. It is impossible to tally, but 19th century murder was undoubtedly more common. There have been a number of explanations of this, from the FBI claiming better law enforcement standards, to the book Freakonomics claiming that it was legalizing abortion, which is a very interesting argument and should not be dismissed out of hand. Of course, there has been a different sort of violence in recent news, which deserves attention, and might counteract the FBI's claim. Police brutality, especially in regards to racial prejudice, has become a very important subject after Ferguson, Missouri. This is infamously hard to get actual numbers on, though. The only sure thing on this is that we can see individual cases that get lots of news attention. Of course, there are a number of things that show police brutality might not be as bad as the news makes it out to be. We cannot definitively say that there are less cases at any given time in history, but we can point to historical examples that are clearly worse. For instance, lynchings in the South from World War I to the 50s were common, and often supported by law enforcement. Labor strikes for a while often ended in violence, and some of the killing was caused by law enforcement and local militia only. Look at the Great Strike of 1877, the May Day Strike of 1886, the Coal Miner Wars, the 1894 Pullman Strike, and the first Red Scare. Violence was endemic in how the police handled these, and that is no longer the case. The bonus march on Washington, D.C. in 1932 was broken up with tanks against veterans. Even the protests of the 1960s were handled with more violence than they are today. Police brutality may be on the rise, but it is nowhere close to the level it has occupied in American history. But there is one other way of looking at violence that shows that violence is unquestionably falling, but it is also maligned in the media as being on the rise. That's organized violence. There's a few ways of looking at organized violence, though. Gang-related crime is the first thing that comes to mind, but that has been on the decline since the 1990s. There are also historical examples of gang violence in the 19th century that is far worse than anything we could look at post-World War II. There are also historic examples of gang violence pre-World War II that is far worse than anything we could look at post-World War II. You can look at the Hatfield-McCoy feud, and numerous specific but famous small gangs, such as the Wild Bunch, Dalton Gang, and Bugs Moran's gang. The Coal Miner Wars are also a good example here of old gang violence. The violence of these went so far as to have aerial bombing taken place in 1921, and that was by the miners in Blair Mountain, so nothing compares to that. There's another form of organized violence other than gangs, though. War is the biggest form of organized violence. We've probably had more unnatural deaths in America because of war than because of all murders, police killings, and gang violence combined. That being said, our most bloody war was the Civil War, killing more than any other declared wars combined. Of course, many of our wars have been very lopsided on the killing front. From the current war in Afghanistan to Tecumseh's War starting in 1811, there have been numerous wars where the US has an asymmetric kill-to-death ratio in its favor. So deaths can't exactly count as violence either. So the amount of wars is a good way of looking at American violence then. And for that measure, there is no time worse than pre-World War I 20th century, especially thanks to the blundering of Woodrow Wilson. The frequency of wars have been getting better ever since. You should check out my American Small Wars episode for more on the number of wars. But suffice it to say, we have had significantly less wars in the 21st century than prior, despite the global war on terrorism beginning in 2001. All this goes to show that there is definitely less violence in America now than there has been in the past. Crime rates are down, police violence is probably down, organized violence is down, and war is less frequent. All of this happening, as I said before, while there are more Americans living than the total dead. Perhaps we ought to change the timbre of the conversation on American violence. While almost all the violence that does happen is unnecessary and stupid, we should not portray it as something new and different, or even as something worse, because it's not in the slightest. We live in extremely peaceful times. I know that I am less likely to experience violence in America than at any other time in her history, and that should be acknowledged in the national conversation on violence. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I especially would like to hear what you think on this subject. I mean, the whole police brutality thing is kinda up in the air. Anyways, I'll see you next time.